Hello, in this video I'm going to share with you how to sew the cute little summer dress pattern I have that has the butterfly sleeves and a ruffle along the bottom. And I'm going to, in the pattern there'll be two links. You can either do it with the ruffle or without. In this video I'm going to show you how to do it with the ruffle so that you'll know that step. If you're doing it without the ruffle, it's very easy. Just roll under the bottom hem part twice and stitch that right along the fold, and that part is done. So here's the pieces that we're going to use. This is the ruffle. So there's two rectangular pieces for that. The butterfly sleeves are these ovals, and these get folded like this to make a cute little sleeve cap. And I have a bodice. This is an empire dress. So the ruffle will be just underneath the armpit area. That's where, the gathering part on the dress is going to come in. And then I have a back and a front piece for the bodice. And then I have two back pieces and one of the front pieces. So this is very similar to what I used when I cut the dress and did the dress. And then there's lining pieces for the bodice also. And again, I just used the same fabric, but you're more than welcome to use a different fabric for your lining pieces. And to close this one, I'm going to do the plastic snaps this time so that you can see how easy those guys are. Here's my little kit of all my plastic snaps. All right, so we'll get started now. Okay, so just like we did in the dress, I sewed my front and back bodices together just at the shoulder seams. And I did that on both pieces, the lining and the outer fabric, just like that. So those both are sewn only at the shoulder seams on each side, right sides together. And then I'm going to iron the seam open flat. So now we're going to do the butterfly sleeves. So I folded these in half so that you get like a watermelon type of shape, actually. And then with my longest stitch length, which is a 4 on my machine, I did a basting stitch, 1/4 of an inch away from this raw edge, all the way around the arc on both pieces. Then I folded this in half, just like that, and I put a pin in because I did not use my water washable pen to do the pattern seam allowances and the marks that'll give you center marks. If you use that, you will have a little hash line here that'll tell you where the center is. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to decide which one of these bodice pieces I want to be the front of my dress, because I use the same fabric. All right, I'm going to pick this one here. I don't know why, but I did. So now I'm going to place this with the pin on the seam here, just like that. And I'm going to start pulling up this thread. So I'm taking one side and one piece of our gathering thread here, and I'm pulling this up. And I'm going to pull this up till this length along here measures 1.5 inches. And once I get it pulled up to where I want it, I'm going to put a pin here at this end. And now I'm going to wrap the thread that I just pulled in a figure 8 around this, and this will hold the stitching from moving out and adjusting. So this measurement between the pin and the end here is 1.5 inches. And I'm going to do this, repeat the same thing on this other side. I'm going to pull from the same side. You don't want to pull from opposite sides. You want to pull from the same side, your thread. This is why you leave long tails on the edge when you're doing gathering, so that you have thread to pull. Okay, so now I've got these separated, and I'm pulling from the same side, because here's my pin, my figure 8. And I'm doing this side, and I'm pulling this up till it measures also 1.5 inches. or the whole piece measures 3 inches. Okay, so now I'm going to put a pin on this side and wrap, again, the thread that I pulled in a figure 8 around this. Okay, and now I am going to lay this down and adjust my gathers, and I'm going to line up the raw edge of the butterfly sleeve with the raw edge of the armpit of the sundress. And I'm just going to pin this in. One more here to hold this. And I'm doing this now on both sides. And I just use my finger to adjust my gathers so that I have a nice spread out even amount along the whole 3-inch length. I say the pin also works really well, the tip of a pin, to move these gathers around. You can just take the pin like this and pull and adjust the gather with the pin. Here I am at the end, and I pin this in. And now I'm going to sew this along the underarm section all the way from the side seam here over the gather. So I am just going to start here where the ruffle and the bodice come together. And I'm going to lock this in. And I'm going to pull these pins out as I come to them. And keep on sewing around. About 1/4 of an inch away. Till I come all the way to the end of the ruffle on this side, sewing off the edge and back stitching to lock this in. All right, so you're going to repeat this on the other side. You're going to trim all your threads back. You're going to pull out your gathering thread because you don't want that to show. So you're just going to give that a pull. Look at this side here and you can see where, I don't know if I can get that. Yeah, maybe right there. You can see how it shows a little bit right here, my gathering stitches, and definitely here. So I want to make sure I pull all that gathering thread out. Okay, so both of those ruffle cap sleeves now are sewn in to the bodice. So we're going to put this aside, both the bodice and the lining pieces. So now we're going to sew the 2 bottom pieces of the back together, and then we're going to attach that to the front section of the bottom of the dress. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the 2 back sections, and you can see how they have this L shape cut out here. So we're going to take this edge and we're going to roll this under a very scant amount and then roll it again, and we're going to press this to hold this, and then we're going to stitch along this fold line here all the way down, and we're going to do this on both pieces. So I'm going to take this to my iron now and press this flat, and then I'm going to stitch this, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I sewed this little hemline here, flap, rolled it over twice and just stitched right close to the edge. So now what we're going to do is we're going to place this wrong side together, totally backwards of what you usually do. But we are going to enclose this seam here, this back center seam, in a French seam, and this is how you do that. You start first by sewing the wrong sides together of your fabric, and we're going to do this a scant less than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So just so you know that, this is going to be a little bit less than the usual 1/4 of an inch seam allowance that I have on all my patterns. So I'm going to start here, and I'm starting not so my edge of my zigzag foot is with the fabric, but the edge of my fabric is actually right here at the tip of where this gauge shows you. So this is where I'd normally line my fabric up with. I'm just doing it a scant under the usual place. So we're going to lock this in, come forward to this corner and turn a nice sharp turn here, leaving our needle down and rotating our fabric, and then sewing all the way to this bottom edge, and again locking this in. Now we did this on the nightgown. If you looked at that one, I snipped this tight right turn corner. I snipped in on my fabric, and I'm going to do that here again so that this will lay nice and flat and smooth when this gets turned to the proper direction. So I am going to snip this in to that corner, not cutting through my stitching, just right to it, close to it. See how I nipped that in to form a V there? Hope you can see that here. There we go, maybe that way. I got a lot of glare from the sun this morning here. So now I'm going to turn this right side together, and I'm going to take this to my mini easy press, and I'm going to give this whole seam a nice press. You'll see here's that corner we nipped. See how that's turning very nice? There's no puckering. That's the secret. All right, so I've ironed that nice and flat. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew a seam that the seam allowance is larger than the 1/4 of an inch. So we're going to sew just along here to seal in these raw edges. You can see them now, they're underneath here. There's the raw edges, so we're sealing those into a seam. That's what we're doing here. Okay, so I turn this now so that it's the right side, and you'll have hash marks here that show you where this fold line is, and line this up. And I gave this a nice press. This forms a flap that you need to get this dress onto the doll. So to create attach the back pieces now to the front piece, along the shorter sides, I place them again with the wrong side together to start out with, sewed a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Then I turn this so that it's now right side together. Gave this a press at my mini easy press, and now you're going to come back and you're going to sew a little bit larger than a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way down this side, just like I did at this other edge. This side is already done, and you can see when you turn this to the right side, you don't see any of those raw edges showing. They've all been sealed in the seam that we created here. Okay, so they're both sewn now, and that is how you create a French seam. Now, if you don't want to do that, that's fine. You can just bring your seams right side together, so a 1/4 of an inch. Then on all this raw edge, you have some options. You could use bias binding tape to cover this. You could serge it if you have a serger. You could do an overcast stitch. You could just do a zigzag stitch through the edge of the seam where the raw edges are to help seal all that thread in. Okay, so now we're ready to attach the ruffle to the bottom if we're going to do that. If you are going to do a dress without a ruffle, you're now going to come down to this bottom seam edge here. Here's the placard we formed up here. So this is the top of this skirt part. So you're going to come down to the bottom edge here, and you're going to roll this, and then you're going to roll it again, just like that. And you're going to iron this all nice and flat, and then you're going to sew right next to this fold a stitch line. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to attach the ruffle to mine. Okay, so to attach the two ruffle pieces together, we're going to do the exact same thing that we did to the bottom skirt. On the side, we're going to line up the two short edges, and we're going to place them wrong side together, do a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Then we're going to press this open along that seam, and we're going to sew a little bit larger than 1/4 of an inch. And I already did that at this end, so you can see, again, that you don't see the raw edges through here, that's all sealed. Okay, so now I put the hem on the bottom of this ruffle, so I rolled this under a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch, gave it a second roll, pressed this nice and flat, and now right along this fold line here, I'm going to do a top stitch. So I'm going to leave my stitch length out to 4. That's the more decorative look for a top stitch. So do a longer stitch length. Now I'm just using white thread. If you wanted this to really look really nice and more professional, you switch out here and use a color that, you know, matches this part, which I would have chose red or black even as a contrast for it, but I'm just going to continue with my white thread. So I am stitching first at 0 stitch length and going to do a couple stitches just like that. Now I'm going to increase this out to 4, which is my longest stitch length, and I'm going to sew all around this edge close to that fold line. Okay, so when I got back to where I started, I went down again to a 0 stitch length and did about 3 stitches in place, so that way you don't see back and forth on your top stitching here. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the gather threads. So these are sewn with a stitch length of 4 on my machine. So I'm going to come here to one of the sides, and I am going to put my fabric right on the edge of my zigzag foot here to come down 1/4 of an inch on this fabric. Again, I got my stitch length at 4, and I have long threads hanging out the back of my machine here, because we need those threads to pull. So I'm just going to go around till I come to the other side seam, and I'm going to stop there. As soon as we get there, I'll show you what I'm going to do. So I'm coming up now to my other side seam. I'm stopping here with my needle up, and I'm pulling this out now, and I'm cutting and leaving long threads. Now I'm going to come to the other side that I haven't stitched yet, and I'm going to start another row of stitches here. And again, 1/4 of an inch from the edge, and I'm not locking this in place until I come around to the other side where we started. And I'm going to do the same thing there. I'm going to cut it, leaving long threads. Here we go. We're back at where we started. So I'm going to stop, long threads, cut this, and we're ready to go now to form the gather. So I'm going to put my stitch length back down to 2.5, which is what I use. So I'm taking the bottom part of my dress now, and this would have been the end that you would have done a hem if you were not putting this ruffle on. So we're going to attach it to that same edge. We're not doing it to the top here where the placard is. We're doing it here to the bottom. And you're gathering, your ruffle pieces should be hash marked where the center is along this one side. And you're going to line that up to, again, to the hash marks that are on this bottom section of the dress, the skirt part, if you were using the water washable pen to mark your seam allowance. Otherwise, I'm just folding this in half, lining up my side seams, and where it folds here in this flat front piece, I'm putting a pin, and that's your center. The back has a seam right here, so you don't need to put a pin there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this so it's right side out. And with my ruffle, with the wrong side out, I'm going to come along, and this is my back seam. And I'm going to match that black pin to my back seam and just adjust it so it's now holding both through the skirt and through the ruffle. Coming along here to my side seams that are not marked at all because they're where a seam comes together. And I'm going to put a pin in here. And this is the pin we're going to use to pull up the gathers here. We're going to gather this up very similar to what we did on the sleeve. So again, I'm coming and finding my center front, which has the 2 black pins, lining those up, removing one of the pins and putting the pin in there to hold that, and coming around now to the other side, matching this side seam up and putting a pin through here to hold this. And that, again, that's what we're going to wrap our gathering threads around. Now on my sides here, I need to make sure that I have one of the threads, the thread that is on this side, pulled out here so that I can easily grab them. See, this one here has gone behind, so I'm just pulling it forward so that it's on the side that I'm working on. This one here is already pulled out. And I think this is the same. Yep, this is the same one on this other side. So the 2 threads are here where I need them to be. So just like we did in the sleeve, we're going to start pulling this thread and go very, very easy and gently, because you don't want to snap this thread. And with your fingers, start working your gathers down. And you're going to do this. See, I overgathered. See how this is my skirt part and it billows away? So I overgathered. So now I'm just going to work some of this back till I get this where I want it to be, where it lines up, the raw edges line up with the skirt part. Okay, that is perfect. So now I'm going to form the figure 8 around this pin. And I'm going to go on the same side I'm working on here, and I'm going to go around to the other side and do the same thing. I'm going to pull up this thread until I get this to match up. And then I'm going to figure 8 this around. Be careful you don't catch up your other thread that you need to pull for the other side yet. Okay, so now I have one side all pulled up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work these gathers down so that I have a little bit of gathering along, pretty evenly spaced along this whole stretch here. Now you can use your fingers or you can use the tip of a pin to do that. The pin tips work really well for moving these fabrics around and the gathers. And like I said, I'm going to try to do this. See how easily that moved that? Try to space it as well as I can through these whole sections on both sides of that center pin, which I accidentally pulled out. All right, so there's the center pin again. And again, I'm just gently moving these gathers so that they're more evenly spaced throughout this section, not all bunched up in one area. Okay, and then matching the raw edges now. And putting in my pins. And then I would repeat this on the back side, which I'm not going to show you here when I do this. I'm just going to do it on this one side. And then once I get both sides stitched, I am going to come along and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around this bottom to attach the ruffle. Okay, so I pulled out my gathering threads. So now the ruffle is attached. Now we need to figure out how to finish off these raw edges here. So once again, I could do a simple zigzag. I could do an overcast stitch with my machine. I could serge this, which is what I'm going to do. I could put bias binding on this. Choices, there's a lot out there. You just need to decide what works for you. Okay, so I am doing a little top stitch here along this bottom seam here where we attach the ruffle at the bottom. I press this up so it goes towards the body of the dress, the seam. And now what I'm doing is I'm coming along right here on the top, a little bit under 1/4 of an inch away from the seam here, and doing a top stitch. And I'm just doing this all around this bottom edge, just to give this, again, a more finished look, and it'll lie flatter for you in the overall project. So for the gather at the top of the body of the dress, I put a pin here to mark where the overlap is on the back piece. The front piece I don't have to. It's been ironed so you can see the crease there. And then I folded this in half, matching my side seams. And I came here to the front and I put another pin in. It's right there, where that front crease is, so that I know where my center front is. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch from the black pin a basting gathering stitch all the way around until I come back up here to where the pressed seam is. So just one continuous, don't back and forth or lock this in. Stitch length at 4, long tail of thread so that I know where to, I have the thread so that I can pull this together. So again, just sewing around the whole top edge. Okay, I'm back to that other edge where that pressed line was, and now I'm just going to cut this off and leave long tail. So now we can attach this to our bodice, the outer piece. So now we're going to sew the lining to the bodice piece. So this is the same way I did it in the dress. You line up your sleeve opening, your armpit opening, and just pin this around on both sides. Make sure that on the lining that you have that seam open, and also on the bodice, this is the top shoulder seam, that those are both open and pinned together, pinned flat, so that they stay flat when you sew. And coming around this side here, and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch from the raw edges here that I'm lining up. Okay, so it's pinned just like this, and I will sew this on both sides, and then the next thing is to sew the back opening and the neckline together. Okay, when you're sewing this underarm area, the sleeve area, it helps if you sew on the side that you can see the stitching of where you attached your sleeve. Then that way you can be sure that you stitch either directly on that line or just a hair towards the inside, the left side of this line as you're stitching along, so that those stitches don't show from the outside. So now we're going to pin all around the neckline area. And when you're working here at the center top seams, make sure that you push in the little ruffled sleeve cap, the butterfly. When you sew through this area, you want to make sure that you don't catch that up. So just kind of tuck it in there so that it's out of your stitch line. And we're going to finish pinning this off, and then we'll sew all around, again, 1/4 of an inch. And here at this angle here, when we're sewing from the bottom up here to this angle, we're going to turn, leaving our needle down into the fabric, and then rotate, raising the presser foot and rotating the fabric so that it is pointed in the new direction, and then sewing off in our new direction. I'll demonstrate that right here for you so you can see that really quick. Locking in this stitch, and I'm going to sew up to about 1/4 of an inch. Right there, stop with my needle down, rotate, turn the direction I want to go, and now I'm set to sew off this way. So now that we've sewn both armpits all the way around and the neckline, we're now going to trim these corner points here on the back seam. We're going to trim this down so this will turn nice and sharp for us. Just going to take a 45-degree nip out of there, not cutting through our stitches. Be careful you don't do that. And then we're going to go all around these curved edges here. All around here and at both of the arm openings. And we're going to nip in to that stitch line. Just like that. We're just going to go all the way around and nip. So I hope you could see that. Sometimes I don't get this quite in the camera, but we're just going around and nipping now right up to that stitch line. And when you get up here, sometimes in the corners, it's a little thick. So be careful that you don't cut all the way through your stitch line. Okay, so I snipped around all the curves, and now we're ready to turn this right side out. So I'm reaching in through the front of the bodice here to the sleeve area on one side, and here's my sleeve ruffle. So I'm pulling that out, slowly going around, pulling this out. Almost there. Okay, and there it is. That is all pulled out. Here's our back center seam, and we're going to use a point turner to push this and make it nice and smooth, just like that. And I'm going to go around and do the same on the other side. So I turned this all so that it's the right side out, and I gave this a press so that everything lays nice and flat along the neckline here. And now what we need to do is we need to sew the side seam here, this little tiny seam that is still left unsewn. So I took my two seams from the sleeve here, and I turned them so that they face towards the back or the lining side, and gave this a pin. And now I'm going to keep this straight, the seam here, and sew this 1/4 of an inch along here, and I'm going to do that on both sides. All right, so that seam is stitched. Now I'm going to turn everything to the right side here. You can see there's the seam and the side seam. And I'm going to come here to this, I'm going to give this a press. Okay, so now it's time to attach the body of the dress to the bodice. So I'm working on the right side of my bodice here. I say look for the center mark line of the front. If you don't use the water washable seam allowances, you won't have a mark if you don't use that pin. So I'm folding mine in half because I did not use the pin. And I am putting a pin in here, a black one, to mark my center front. Okay, so now I have that. Make sure that when you attach your body of your dress that you are keeping your lining part folded away, because we're not going to stitch that part. And we have the right side. So this is our outer right side. And we're going to align that. First, I'm going to align the center front with either the 2 hash marks or my pins. And I'm attaching that. And then I'm coming here now to the side seam and aligning the side seam up. Just like that. Coming here to the back. Now this is the side that does not fold under. So I'm bringing this all the way to the edge here, folding my lining part away, and here's my back seam on my lining and bodice, and that's what I'm lining up the edge of the dress body to, and I'm putting a pin through here to hold this. And then we're going to go around and do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to align the center, the side seams. I'm aligning those, and then I'm going to do the center back. So now I'm aligning my center back on this other side. This is the side that folds over like this on the dress body. So I am taking that crease line, and that's what I'm putting my center back of my bodice against. So there's the fold line. Here's the center back of my bodice, and I'm aligning those and pinning that together. Then I am folding this is the part that is remaining here. This is the fold over part, or the fold back part. And I'm now putting that, aligning it with the raw edge on the lining of the bodice. This is the only thing we're going to sew that's going to attach in this next step to the actual lining. So the next step is we need to gather up this body of the dress to fit onto the bodice. So again, I'm taking my basting gathering stitch and I'm pulling very gently. And now I'm working this gather down past my side seam, because we need this gather to go all the way to the center of the dress. So again, just pulling it gently, moving down my gathers, past my side seams here. See how it's now gathering towards that center? That's what we want. Want this to gather all past that into the center. Just keep on gently pulling this thread. Until you get enough gathering past the center here in this section that the dress looks pretty good there. It's pulled up pretty nicely to the bodice. And now the back section here, kind of overdid this a little bit. So, okay, so I've loosened that up. That all lines up pretty nice in there now. And now I'm going to figure eight this to hold this. And then I'm going to go around and move this gathering so it's more evenly spaced throughout this whole section here, from the center front to the side. And I'm going to put pins in. Then I'm going to go around and I'm going to do the exact same thing to the other side. Okay, so I've got this all pinned now, and I'm going to go around now and I'm going to stitch this all together. Now I'm starting at the end where it goes around to my lining, because I want to keep my gathering part above on the top so that I can make sure that those gathers don't move around too much. So I am starting here, going to lock this in place. 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm sewing all around here. Now the one thing you have to be careful with is that you do not, outside of this end that we're starting with, that you do not catch up your lining in this seam, because this is kind of tight through here and it's very easy to catch up the lining if you're not careful So keep an eye on the back side here, the underneath side, under here, that the lining is facing away from you and you're not sewing that into the seam. Okay, so I'm going to finish sewing that up and I'll be back. This is what I meant about be careful that you don't catch up your back lining bodice into this seam, which I did here at the end. So I'm going to take this out and fix this. So when you're sewing this other end here, be careful. Like you saw, I sewed up this bodice. Kind of pull this away from your stitch line and towards you here, so that you don't catch this section up, and then come all the way down to this part here where they meet up, the dress body and the bodice. And so very, very slowly, you can hand crank through here. All right, and then just lock this in. Okay, and there you go, almost done. So now, like we've done in all the other sections we've done gathering, I'm going to pull out all this thread that we used to gather, because some of it will probably show from the right side here. This is the right side of the dress now. So I'm pulling all that out and we're almost done. All right, so I pulled out all that gathering stitches. So now what I'm going to do, this is the back center that ended up where it lined up between the end of the dress and the end of the end of the bodice and the end of the dress body. So I am now folding this with the seam we just stitched up. And this is the lining here. And I'm folding up the lining, and now I'm going to rotate this over so it is covering that seam we just stitched. And I'm going to put a pin in here to hold this, just like that. Because what we're going to do is we're going to cover this whole seam that we just gathered up with the bodice lining. Now here at the armpit, you may have to trim down the seam we just did. I think when I go to actually post this project, I'm going to make this a little bit wider, or longer, I should say, the seam on the side, because this is really kind of tight. So if you cut that down, this will work if you need to. So I'm just barely rolling over that lining, and now I'm folding it down here. And here's my arm opening. You can see that. And again, I'm putting a pin in here to hold this together. And now this is the back section that I already did the corner. So now I'm just turning this up and laying this so that the lining comes right down and covers that stitch line we just did, just like that. And then we're going to machine stitch this, and it'll leave a decorative stitch. It should be pretty close to, this is now on the right side. It'll be very, very close to this seam here. You can do this by hand too if you don't want it to show through. All right, so I pinned the one side, pinned all the way through the center. Again, I cut down this seam here, the width of it in the armpit area. And now we're coming on to this other end. Now this is the part that folded over. So what I'm doing is I'm keeping this seam up towards my bodice as I fold this over right at the edge there. Here's the edge, what this looks like on the right side. And I'm going to pin this here to hold this for me. And then I'm going to finish pinning and turning under this section here on this back on the other side. All right, so I've pinned the lining, now turning it under to cover that seam all the way around. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this right side out. It's just easier to for me to stitch this way. So the dress is all right side out. And I'm going to stitch all along here till I come to this other end. Then what I'm going to do at this end is I'm going to turn and I'm going to sew a top stitch all the way around the neckline area, 1/4 of an inch away, coming back to our starting point. So I'm going to do a stitch length of 4 through here, and I'm going to start at 0. To get this started, just do a couple stitches in place. Now I'm going to open this up to 4, and I'm going to stitch this all along this edge here, close to the fold where we tucked under the lining. And again, be careful of what you're doing with the dress edge here. Try to keep the gathers all nice and evenly spaced. And just move this around slowly as you go around. And I'll be back once I get to that other side, the back seam. All right, so I've come around here now to my other back seam. And I'm just going to finish sewing this along here, the lining. All right, now as I get here to this point here, which is the end, I'm going to stop about 1/4 of an inch away from this seam here. My needle down and do a pivot, and now I'm going to sew up towards this corner. This is just going to form a top stitch around your neckline. And sewing about 1/4 of an inch away from the neckline curve here. Just going all the way around. Just like this till we get back to where we started. And then we're going to lock this stitch in place by going back down to 0. And the only thing we need to do is attach a closure to the dress back. I'm going to use snaps in this video to show you how to do that. And here we are back now where we started, so I'm going to meet up with that stitch line. And again, going back down to 0. To sew right in place a few stitches, and that's it. Trimming off these stitches. All my threads. Okay, so that's what it looks like now across the front where we stitched the lining of the bodice to the body of the dress so that this seam is completely encased. Like I said, you could do this by hand if you like, if you don't want these stitches to show. I'm just going to iron all this and then we'll put the snaps on. Okay, so the last step we have on this sundress is to put the snaps in the back. I say you can see I've already applied them here, and I'll go through the steps to show you how to do this. Now, you're going to need 4 pieces for each set. You're going to need 2 of the spike pieces. These look like tacks, so 2 of the tack-looking pieces. 1 of the female pieces and 1 of the male pieces. And I always start with the outside piece first, the outside snaps. So if I've overlapped this dress so that the placard all lays flat, this lays all nice and flat in here. And then what I did was I came up here to this top edge and I took 1 of the spike pieces and I placed it on the outside where I thought it would work. And I wanted to make sure that the edge of the spike piece was not hanging off of this side And when this was snapped together, it wasn't going to be farther over to the left than this back piece. So I centered it as best as I could in there, and then I just pushed it with my fingers through the fabric. It pokes through the fabric very, very easily. Then once I did that, I took my male component, that's this piece here. You can see it sticks out on the top versus the female component, which is flat on the top, has no depth to it. So I put this over the spike that was poking out here, just like that. And then I took the pliers that come with these snaps, and the black base is a flat base, and that's the part that goes against the back of the tack component. So I put this over the two pieces, making sure that the parts did not come apart, that the center of the tack was sticking out of this male component. And I put this over, and I gently started to squeeze the handle together. Just like that, like I'm doing here. And I pressed hard and firm and held it for a couple seconds. Then I released this. And the tack component inside, the point, is now been crushed and flattened down, and that's what holds the snap together. And then I decided where I wanted my second part, and I put the second piece of the snap here. And then I took a pen, a water washable marking pen, and I drew and colored in around the top of this male component, just like this. And now the next step you do is you're going to fold and put the two pieces back the way you want them. So just like that. And I press down onto a firm surface. I press down these two outer male components so that it left an imprint and a marking from the pen, the marking pen, on this fabric on this side, so I could see exactly where I needed to insert the next tack pieces. So now these go on the back side. So I poked it through from the back so that the center of the tack came out in the center of the marking that was left by the male component on this side of the fabric. And I took the female component and I put that on top, and I just did the same thing. I took my pliers here, inserted, gave this a firm squeeze, and that one was set. And I just repeated it again with my second one. So that's how you put on these plastic snaps. The trade name is Cam. I just buy generic ones, but they're very, very easy, and they work great on so many different kinds of projects. So I'm also going to make for this a little tote bag, but I'll do that in a separate video that you can watch, so that she has a coordinated little bag to go with this for her doll. And like always, you can find me at Fabric Fun with Cricut Design Space Facebook group. You can ask me any questions you may have about this video there. You need to be a member of Cricut Design Space before you can join the Fabric Fun group. Just a little heads up. Hope you enjoyed my video.